Welcome to the Mayo Clinic Human Optimization Project, where we're creating the blueprint to help you become the best human you can be. I'm your guide and fellow optimizer, Christopher Camp. Connection with other people is one of the most important ingredients to a happy, fulfilling, and successful life. In order to connect with others, you must communicate with others. However, in our hyper-electronic, busy, increasingly virtual world, the art of communication has become a lost art for many of us. This is something that we have to change. To help us get started in that journey, our session today is titled The Power of Connection: How to Communicate Effectively with Anyone. And here are the three big questions we're going to answer over the course of this session. Our first one: what does effective communication look like, and why is it so important? Our second: why do so many of us struggle with clear and effective communication? And then lastly, we'll start to talk about some solutions. And our third big question is, what steps can individuals take to better communicate and connect with the people in their lives? To help us answer these questions, today we have Dustin Morse with us. Dustin, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Dustin is the Senior Vice President of Communications and Public Affairs for the Minnesota Twins Baseball Club. He has oversight on all baseball and business communication efforts, creative content, publications, civic partnerships, and media and player relations. On game days, he's the spokesperson for the club, manages access to players, staff, and executives, and messaging. He also represents the club on the road. He's got over 23 years of experience in Major League Baseball communications and was the winner of the 2020 Major League Baseball Robert O. Fischel Award for Public Relations Excellence. One of the things I love about you, Dustin, is not only that you've been doing this for over 20 years, is that your role in your job often requires you to communicate one-on-one with individuals in a very high leverage situation, but it also requires you to communicate with the masses, and that some of your messaging is read by literally hundreds of thousands of people. So I think that you've seen sort of the full spectrum of this. So very excited to have this discussion with you today.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the intro, and thanks for kind of breaking down what we're going to discuss today. Obviously, there's a lot of forms of communication. There's a lot of ways to communicate, right? And everybody's got a different style. I guess this comes from how I've handled my career and working in sports, a fast-paced, think-on-your-feet type of job. So it's not necessarily the only way to do it, but it's maybe some tricks and tips along the way that have worked for myself and my staff and the Minnesota Twins that we'll dive into.
Perfect. Well, let's do that. Let's jump in. So first, let's start with some definitions. How do you define communication? I think we often think of it as spoken word, but it's really probably more than that.
Yeah, as we just touched, there's a lot of different ways to communicate, right? There's the written word and spoken word, but I also think just body language and how you sit in a room and how you present yourself, even how you dress. It's different events. You might have a different style that you're walking into. So a lot of different ways to communicate, but ultimately the goal is to get your point across. Some way connect with that individual or that group, kind of hit on the points that you want to, be concise and be, obviously accurate and correct with what you're trying to say. So it's really being prepared and walking into a room with a goal and connecting with that individual through, the many forms of communication.
Good. Well, can you tell me some of the key elements of effective communication? And maybe you can list some of the concepts, and then after listening, we can go back through and kind of unpack them.
Yeah, there's a lot of C's here. I'm going to start with clarity. You've got to, we'll get into the specifics, and also being concise and complete, correct, considerate. You want communication where it's a two-way street too. You want some feedback and kind of work off of whoever you're talking to on, what they're trying to accomplish too, some give and take, if you will. So there's a lot of key elements to being a good communicator, but I think the most important is probably being clear with your message and concise.
All right, so let's start. So I got most of those jotted down here. Let's start back at the top and tell me, what exactly do you mean by clarity?
Well, I mean, I think you want your message to be clear and easy to understand. You can get in the weeds pretty quickly and get things complicated. And I think if you aren't clear from the jump, you're not going to be effective over the course of the conversation or over the course of the meeting. So you just want something that's easy for your, if you do your homework on who you're talking to, that they can understand the message, and maybe just do some check-ins throughout your comments or your message to that individual or to that group to make sure they're following along.
And the next one, conciseness. I think we all know what that is. Tell me why you think that's so important and maybe what can go wrong if you don't do it well.
Yeah, I think we're all guilty of getting a little wordy at times. You want to get to the point, especially if it's more of a formal discussion. We're all a fast-paced lifestyle where you might have 20 minutes with an individual or 10 or 5, or it's a quick, 1-minute catch-up. So, you want to respect, your listeners' time and make sure that you just get to the point and make sure they understand where you're coming from. So, conveying the message in as few words as possible is probably the right play.
But at the same time, you have to balance being complete in your message, right? So use completeness as well. So how do you
That's the art of
balance those two?
communication, right? I mean, you got to be concise with your words, but also be, I guess, complete, right? And make sure all the key points are delivered and acknowledged, right? I do think that feedback piece is important because you don't want to go down a path where somebody just kind of nods and agrees with you and walks out of the room not quite sure what you were trying to either convey or really ask. It might be an ask, and if you're not clear with that, it's just going to set yourself up for being inefficient. You're probably going to have to have a follow-up meeting, follow-up discussion. So getting it right the first time, doing your homework, being prepared, being concise, and being correct is kind of my mission with every conversation, every meeting, every interaction I might have. And like I said, time is usually of the essence. In my fast-paced job, I might only have a second or two. So I'll work my way towards, let's say it's a player that's in the middle of something, maybe getting ready, and they wave me over for that 2 minutes that they have. Hey, I know you needed to talk to me. I better be buttoned up with the message and what I need or what they need, and come with answers as well as my requests. So it's an interesting job. Every day is a little bit different, and maybe the method behind each form of communication changes with the individual that I'm talking with.
Yeah. You mentioned correctness, which I think is obvious kind of what that means. And if you're not correct or you're inaccurate in communication, you're going to lose trust. You're going to lose faith. People will stop listening to you. I think that one's pretty straightforward. One that's a little more interesting, I think, is considerate. You mentioned that. So what do you mean by being considerate, and how do you do it?
It's kind of a fancy way of saying know how to read a room. Sometimes there's emotions involved with a conversation. You might be delivering some bad news or some good news. I think you have to be considerate of how your audience, the state of mind that they're in. It might be a board meeting that's just your company isn't doing quite well, and somebody's got to kind of express, we've got to pick it up or else. And you just have to understand that the mood might change. You can't come in, you might be in great spirits, but somebody might have just lost a family member in the previous month, and you just got to be aware of the emotions. I really think that emotional intelligence, that EQ, is an important part of communicating, and that's what I mean by being considerate. It's just you've got to understand what your audience is going through and take that into account when you're talking to them.
Yeah. In thinking about your audience, you also use that dreaded F word, feedback. That's something that we talk about a lot, and everybody says they want it until they get it. And so what did you mean by that when you listed that off?
Yeah, communication is a two-way street. I think you have to listen as much as you talk. That's an effective communicator, believe it or not, is taking in that feedback. And sometimes it doesn't matter if you're leading the conversation or more listening. It's not always what you want to hear, right? And then how you respond, it's, people are usually quick to be defensive, and the whole conversation changes. I've made a habit of trying to just listen, process, think about how I want to respond, and then deliver a thoughtful message back so the conversation stays professional and it doesn't get contentious or just off the rails. So, feedback is difficult, right? I mean, sometimes the feedback is great and you walk out of the meeting feeling pretty good about yourself. But more times than not, I think people forget to listen and forget that conversation's a two-way street, and you want to give the other person opportunity to express themselves as well.
That's great. I think that's critical, especially in that one-on-one feedback. My next question for you is about feedback when you're communicating to a large group. I don't know if you're aware, but there are some haters and some trolls out there on the internet that sometimes like to come back at you or the twins with a little bit of heat.
Yeah.
And maybe some of it is helpful. A lot of it is maybe not helpful. So how do you sort through the feedback to determine, all right, this is valuable, I'm going to make changes based on this, versus this is garbage, I should just ignore it. How do you do that?
Yeah, a little bit of it is experience. Having gone through it, you kind of learn how to filter out maybe the highs and the lows, and kind of zero in on kind of that mid range. Whether it's comments or nowadays most people can DM you directly through different social platforms, and that's an interesting place where I spend a lot of my time that has changed from the beginning of my career to current. I mean, how we communicate with our fan base is mostly through social platforms and different technology, digital technology, where maybe in the past you'd pick up the phone and call somebody. Now it's, whether it's emails or social platforms. But we have a lot of unique tools, social listening, pay attention to what our fan base is saying. For the most part, like I said, I try to rule out you got super fans that you can do no wrong, and that's not always good either. And then you've got fans that you can do nothing right. So, I've tried to be a very likable, available, accountable employee for the Minnesota Twins that, not afraid to connect with a sensitive fan or somebody that's got an opinion. I will take the call, or I will respond to somebody. Generally try to be open-minded and work with them, let them express their thoughts, and then maybe share some insight that they weren't aware of to kind of course correct. But yeah, large groups, like you had said in the intro, when we put out a message, a statement, or a bit of news, there's millions of people that see it. We represent really the upper Midwest, and we're one of 30. We're a company, one of 30 Major League Baseball teams. So everything that we do or don't do generally is noted publicly in a newspaper or on the news. So we certainly have to take into account all of the range of our fan base, our audience, and our critics and our supporters. So everything is kind of vetted internally before we put anything out externally. It's a lot of work behind the scenes. It's sometimes what makes us the most educated department in the company as well, the communications department, because we just check, with whoever the expert on a certain topic is to make sure we have the facts right with either the written word or the spoken word. So there's a lot of opinions out there in the world I live.
In order to do that, you have to be pretty open-minded and willing to listen to others and take those expert opinions when you're seeking them out, right? So that goes back into that listening component that you talked about.
I was going to say, I sometimes, like, people just tune an opinion out because it's not theirs. I think I'm in the line of work that I need to take into account what people think, right? Perception is sometimes everything. So, and I also feel, coming out of the other end of those conversations or those reports that I get through some social listening apps, I have to take them serious. I have to kind of reshape the narrative if there's a perception out there that we're not doing something right, or we're just off the mark on certain things. I do listen. And sometimes it's difficult because you know that they don't know everything. They don't know everything that, I may know or somebody internally knows. And you have to just take a step back, take a deep breath, think before you respond, and be prepared with that conversation when it comes.
Perfect. And I'll put a plug in too. I've had a chance to see a little bit behind the scenes and how this works, and I've seen some of those comments. And just a shout out to all the haters and the super fans. You don't know all the information that's going on. So I promise you, good people doing the best they can. And if you knew the rest of the story, a lot of times some of those things would make sense. So just pause and think a little bit before you react. You mentioned perception or perspective. One of the things I've always said is that I think a large part of interpersonal conflict between individuals, or maybe the majority of interpersonal conflict, usually boils down to two potential issues. One is either a lack of perspective, or the second is a lack of communication. Meaning, if you and I are in conflict with one another, it might be the thing that we're arguing about that's the problem. But more likely is that either I don't fully understand your perspective and why you feel the way you do, or I'm not doing a good job of communicating how I'm feeling. And oftentimes we may actually be closer than we realize on the argument, but either I haven't communicated or I haven't understood your perspective. What do you think about that?
Well, you were describing an argument, really, right? I mean, emotions get in the way and you don't always turn on that listening skill. You're already ready to respond before you actually hear what somebody else has to say, or that difference of opinion. So, yeah, I mean, and there's a lot that goes into that too, right? I mean, there's different education levels and different ways of communicating. Sometimes there's even a language barrier that creates somebody misheard something, or it creates this idea that we got to argue through some disagreement to get to a resolution, but the key is get to a resolution, right? I mean, the goal is to walk away going back to those tips, what make a good communicator, and being concise and being accurate too. I think that's where a lot of arguments come, is both people think they're accurate. So if you're really going to get into a deep argument about something, you better be right. And if you're not, don't be too proud to admit that maybe you need to do a little more research and you'll circle back with this conversation. But so many times it just escalates into an argument, sometimes based on perception, and sometimes both people can be right. They're just coming at it a different way. And that art of communicating, or that temper that somebody might have, you've heard the short fuse, or that person's a great listener. There's a perception on how that person might respond. It's just personality traits, right? And there's some people that it's really in my line of work with athletes that are maybe dealing with a rough week, rough performance. Some are really good at just kind of taking it and processing it, and some get really defensive and argumentative about it just that approach where you're a little bit more open-minded, you take the feedback in, you process it, generally is the better outcome. But you just described basically the average argument amongst two people or multiple groups. And I think if you just sit back and kind of tap into those listening skills and feedback and make sure you're being concise and accurate. I mean, the goal is to find a resolution, right? I mean, that's the art of effective communication. I mean, and being efficient with it. You don't want to sit and spend all day building your case on why you're right if it's really not going to do much for your company or for you individually. So you also got to take into account is that the hill to die on, really, if it's just not really just the sake to win an argument.
Is it worth it? Yeah, the collateral damage can be substantial. And you described that, for professional athletes having to have that divide or ability to compartmentalize, sometimes maybe compartmentalize their performance on the field from then their ability to answer questions about that. Some are very good at it, some are not. And I would say they're humans just like the rest of us. We're all that way, and that we can often let those things happen, good or bad, then influence how we respond and communicate to others. And some people are good at it, some are bad at it. And I think even within the individual, at some times we're better at it than at other times. So there's quite a bit of variability. So this sort of takes us into our next section. Our second big question was, why do so many of us struggle with clear and effective communication? So I want to hear from you, as somebody who's been doing this for over 2 decades. You supervise, not only are you a communicator, but you supervise a lot of communicators. You have interns that work with you that you're bringing up and teaching. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see people make when they're communicating one-on-one to start?
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody's an expert, right? I mean, coming into a conversation where you already are expecting the outcome, or you want the answer to be a certain way, you do see a lot of young professionals that maybe don't understand the process and just want to get to the result. And I think working through that with that open-mindedness is key, right? Education, everybody's got a different education level too. I mean, I started realizing that things that were taught to me in high school and college are very different than how they're taught today. And I often try to set the tone with younger employees. Usually our interns are usually right out of college, is create an open environment where they're comfortable from the beginning to share their thoughts. I mean, I don't want to close them off and be like, I'm always right. So create a comfortable environment. Sometimes I even get real casual and we'll go out and build a foundation with just some coffee or lunch and share some jokes, show the humor. So it doesn't have to be an intern or somebody that works for you, just the comfort between the two. Because a lot of times I think stress and anxiety push people to a certain communication style, and it doesn't reflect who they are. They're real. You see people, at least for me, new relationships, they're a different communicator in the beginning than they are towards a 6 or 12-month relationship with you. The comfort really helps the communication flow, the back and forth. And listen, I think when you're more comfortable with somebody in a room, the communication is different, right? You're more casual, you're more open, you're not afraid of what they might think or say. It's just, it's common sense. So everything I do is to build relationships. Communication is so effective when there's trust with each other or amongst the group. So I've just always said, in my career, I wanted to build relationships through communication. And then, as we talked about the name of the show, the power of communication, it's amazing when you're there, when you understand it, or when you understand the person you're talking to. I deal with a lot of different people in my line of work, going back to the athlete, right? When you're competing at the highest level in the world and maybe you don't perform up to the expectations on a given night, and within 10 minutes after the game you've got a group of 8 to 10 reporters standing in your face asking you questions that, listen, might come across as they're trying to be sarcastic and break the ice because you went 0 for 4 with 4 strikeouts, and it goes right over their head because you're zoned in on, how am I going to get better tomorrow? I know their mind is here. And there also might be cultural differences too. I mean, we work with a lot of players from around the world. I mean, you name it. Now baseball is a global game, but a lot of times language plays into the equation. And to be an effective communications department, I had to hire differently and bring in bilingual individuals that could support some of our Spanish-speaking players and make sure they understand the question that's being asked. So that's also a big, are you listening, or are you hearing what's being said, or are you just kind of in the zone? And sports sometimes does that to people. Going back to the reporters, their side of things, they're on deadline. They're in a hurry up offense mode, and they need to get a quote and they need to get something fast. And if it's not what they want, then they get a little anxious, and you can kind of see this tension amongst maybe a small group after a competition like a baseball game. So, and it's my job to stand right there and make sure everybody's kind of on the same page. The player understands the question, the media understands the situation. A lot of times I will brief the reporters that are about to interview a player that, listen, here's where he's at right now. Just so you know, we're going to probably have time for 1 or 2 questions. And I think it's in everybody's best interest to just be concise with this one and short and sweet and move on. So,
well, I think a lot of times I watch these post-game press conferences, and it's not just athletes. We see this all the time where they're getting asked questions, and you just watch the game, so you know what happened, either great or terrible, whatever happened for that athlete. I think that probably shapes how they're feeling much more than the questions they're being asked. And it can be very challenging for them to be fully present in that moment, right? They've got their family waiting on them. They want to get out of there. They probably got some treatment they got to go do. Maybe they still got to get a lift in. They got a bunch of stuff going on. They're not in the best mood. And so being present is really difficult. But I think that's true of all of us, actually living in that moment, being given it our full attention, all of our energy focused on it without any distractions. So I think that those things can be pretty important for communication, yet we as human beings are sort of getting worse at all of those things, I think. Have you noticed that as well?
I agree. I mean, tablets, screen time has changed the way, some of today's children are advancing with socializing in the neighborhood, right? And building some of those communication skills. It's now they're snapping and texting each other, and it's kind of short form, I mean, the written word has changed quite a bit, and I'm guilty of it too. I mean, it's you just don't write long form emails anymore or write letters. So communicating through almost slang, unique language these days is acceptable. So you've kind of got to adapt how are you going to communicate with a 16-year-old versus maybe a 75-year-old in our sport. Baseball connects generations. So many times we might even be communicating to a 6-7-year-old or a 90-plus-year-old. So there's different ways to connect with different people. It's also it's sports, right? I mean, you got to remind everybody in the room that the sun will come up tomorrow. I know that there's jobs on the line. There's the spoken word when you're playing in a sport where you're put on a pedestal. It's not everybody signed up to be a spokesperson. Not everybody signed up to be a public figure. I've had several players over the years come to me with social anxiety, the fear of public speaking. When the cameras turn on, they freeze. They don't like talking about themselves. I do all this prep work with them as we sign these players or we work together in spring training. But you go to New York or LA or Boston and even Minneapolis, there is there's a lot of cameras that are in your face. And I think we just have to remind ourselves that not everybody is a super polished public speaker, and communication is going to come across in different ways. And that's been a fun part of my job too, in the player relations role, is how do we humanize these players too? How do we show that they're vulnerable? How do we show emotion? How do we use our content creators to show what they're like in real life, that they are human beings and that they have a family, and not everything goes perfect, but it does affect the way they communicate the next day at the office. So the more we do of that as we kind of march into the future, it's somewhat more acceptable to show that you're not a superhero and you're vulnerable. So it's all these different ways to put our players and our staff members and anybody that is associated with the Minnesota Twins, put them in a position to succeed. And some are better than others for sure. And I know who to lean on when we need somebody that really hit on a point. Whether it's on the business side or the baseball side, I'm blessed to work with a lot of great people that have had formal training, and some it just works. It just clicks on how to be an effective communicator. And when you run into somebody that struggles with it, there is professionals that, you can put yourself into some different, media training if you're in a career where you're in front of the camera, and it's never too late to start. I think it's a fun art, and it's really fun when you can just open up with somebody, or when you have that confidence to stand in front of a group and deliver your message. That was not always for me, but I took some courses that really changed the way I thought that everybody in the room is really not comfortable with public speaking.
Yeah.
So if you just kind of understand that and say, I'm the one up here speaking, and it's a really fun art.
Well, you mentioned a few things that people can do to get better at it. So I want to jump into that in a second when we get to our third big question. But before, you mentioned something I've actually never really thought about until you started talking. I started that question out by saying one of the problems with communication is that people aren't present in the moment. They're distracted. They don't care about the other person. They're basically putting too little emphasis on the conversation and sort of blowing it off. But I think the flip side of that may be true as well. There's a lot of people that have a lot of fear and anxiety around communication and speaking. And I wonder if those individuals may almost be too present, and that they're allowing that moment to overcome them or overtake them. So that's almost the opposite of the person who's completely blowing it off and doesn't care, that there may be some who care too much and are worried about what people think and how they're going to be perceived. So have you seen that issue in people you've worked with, and how do you counsel folks that maybe allow that situation to become bigger than what it should be in their minds? Then they start to have that fear and anxiety and apprehension.
You just brought up like a real life situation I'm dealing with a coworker that's very sensitive to what's being said in the room, almost takes things too literally with whether you're in the boardroom and that individual's singled out, and the follow-up after the meeting was, what was meant by that? What, did I screw something up? And you can almost tell she's an individual that really cares about her reputation and her how she presents herself in these situations. But the advice I give her is she takes everything so literally, whether it's a text or an email. Like, just remember the tone of that text or that email. It might be very different than how you received it from what the sender was meaning behind it. And I just always tell her to pick up the phone or walk into the room and ask, follow up with whatever went down in that particular conversation that you were confused about or concerned about, or just probably took it too literally, and nothing was meant by it. But I think a lot of people, the lack of confidence too to speak up. I was like that. You sit in a room, and it depends on the size of the room. If there's 2 people or 4 people or 6 people, you might be comfortable. But if there's a 18-person meeting and you've got questions or you want some clarity on something, I think half the people don't raise their hand and have the confidence to ask the question because they're afraid of maybe what everybody else in the room is thinking. But I have found in my career, the more you ask, when you walk out of the meeting, everyone's, I'm glad you asked that.
Right.
So again, that gets back to the clarity and really trying to reach a resolution too. I mean, and being efficient with whatever that meeting was, walk out with, everybody knows the action plan, right? What's the next steps? So I think it's just reminding people that be confident in who you are. Don't take everything so literally. And the tone, sometimes the tone is really hard to read in the written word. just if you're unclear, don't be afraid to ask the person
Yeah.
what they meant.
Yeah. That's a great point. And that I do think that others in the room often have that same question, but it can be difficult to ask. But one of the things I think, at least that I've learned, is that it's hard to ask the first time. It's easier to ask the second time and the third time and the fourth time. So it's like anything. You practice it, you're going to get better at it. And so you can improve on that if you just keep doing, it may be difficult, may be awkward, may be challenging, but eventually you can get better.
And also, you got to be that word considerate. If it's a meeting where it doesn't, you don't have time for 50 questions,
Right.
Maybe get your high level question out and then
Follow up.
Follow up.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's do it. Let's transition to this sort of third section. It's always my favorite, where we start talking about solutions. So, we started to get into it a little bit about how things you can do and that you maybe can get better at this. But we also mentioned some people are just naturally better at it. So which is it? Are we born good or bad communicators? Is it developed over time, or a mix?
Well, I think it's a mix. It's a great question and probably could be discussed. I mean, I think there's some people that really have a gift from the beginning, right? That they like the attention. They're not afraid to express how they feel. Sometimes they dominate the conversation, which could backfire later in life. But you hear stories all the time that, somebody that might have had a speech impediment or something when they were young, and they worked really hard to be a communicator or president of the United States. You can get to a level where anything's possible if you put your work into it. So I do think the art of communication will have media training, maybe once a year, twice a year, and you see people get better. I see some younger players in year 2, year 3, year 4 get better at communicating with how they're feeling health-wise or something, speaking to a doctor, or if they're speaking to the media, which is ultimately speaking to the fan base. So I definitely believe that you can get better at it. Unfortunately, I think the only way to get better, though, is to do it.
Right.
And
right.
there's going to be some rough, I think the joke is always, at least with professional athletes, you pull some clips, because it's well documented, the bad interviews out there, how raw they were when they were a 20, 21-year-old kind of coming out like they knew everything.
We've all been there.
Those generally resurfaced
Yeah.
by the veterans, but it's maybe a cop-out answer, but some people just have it. And are really well spoken and a great storyteller. I mean, those people are generally, kind of the center of attention in a room because they're humorous and they can just deliver the punchline, and everybody just gravitates towards them. Right? That shows you the power of communication and how valuable it can be with personality. So. Put the work in, find some formal training, maybe take some of these tips and work to get better. But also know if you have it, try to find a way to use it and help others around you.
And question I have too is, oftentimes you see folks that are bad communicators and they know that they're bad. You see some that are good and they know they're good. But oftentimes you see some that are maybe poor communicators and don't realize it. Don't have insight into that. They're not nervous or apprehensive. They just can't effectively, get their point across. So what are some tips or things people should look out for to know if they're doing a good job? Or maybe more importantly, what should they be looking out for to know if they're doing a bad job in communicating and need to improve?
Yeah, the bad job, it's everybody else kind of knows that maybe the person delivering the message isn't doing a great job. I see it often with maybe a sit-down interview and really short answers. We'll have a player that just doesn't really understand, and it's my job to prep them. So it's a little bit on me too, but we've had a couple players over the years that just, 1 or 2 or 3 word answers, and it really puts the interviewer on the spot where it's like, okay, I didn't think that was going to be that short of an answer. How do I follow up here? So, I will sometimes even show them the clip and say, here, they're looking for you to expand on your outing. You had a great outing. Talk about. If you don't like talking about yourself, I have a little Post-it note on the podium when we do media that, talk about your teammates, talk about what they did well. If you're a pitcher, you can talk about your catcher. If you're a catcher, you don't like talking about yourself, talk about everybody else on the field. So little tips to basically expand on what you're trying to say when you're in that setting. That's where I see some, at least my line of work, some bad communicators. I've also seen some of our executives that just assume know what they're talking about. And you walk into something and they don't realize they're much more knowledgeable than than I am, or the person that's receiving the message. So I'll often, after the meeting, I've built up enough trust with some of our executives to share with them some feedback that others, because I guess I'm an inviting personality, will share with me their frustrations with not completely understanding what that executive was looking for. And then it's my job also to go to them and say, hey, here's maybe where you assumed your audience knew what you were talking about, but I can tell you that the majority of the room was lost. And they're kind of shocked. Not that they're a poor communicator, they just didn't really understand the level that the audience or coworkers were involved with that particular topic. So, yeah, it's again communicating to those. Sometimes that's the hardest, giving that feedback, right? That wasn't a great interview, or that wasn't a great meeting because X, Y, and Z.
It's interesting for you in your position. You're sort of tasked with helping people along the entire chain of command optimize their communication too. So, you got people you're training that are sort of newer to the game that are just learning, but you've also got some incredibly experienced people that have been doing it for a long time, and you've got to communicate with both of those folks and work with them on how to do a better job of portraying their message, which I think can be challenging.
And it's both a fun and a challenging part of the job when you work for a company that puts out a lot of public statements or news. Who is the official spokesperson? Are we all synced up? That's my job too, to make sure if there's multiple spokespeople on a certain topic, it can get a little cluttered, the space. It's not as concise as you like, and maybe it's not even as accurate as maybe your CEO is delivering the message, and there shouldn't be many others speaking about it if he or she is the spokesperson. So getting everybody on the same page. And then I think there's also a fear of maybe revealing too much. If you're not the boss, some are afraid, gosh, if you're on the record in an interview setting, if you're just talking to, maybe other coworkers, there's still a little bit of fear of like, am I supposed to tell them? Am I not supposed to tell them? It depends on how sensitive the information is. But I think I see some of that in my line of work, I guess is why I bring it up. You're just a little unclear on what is public information, what is private, and when the right time to say it. It's kind of my job to make sure, from top to bottom, we're all buttoned up. Because there's a lot of gamesmanship in sports too. You reveal too much, your opponent is reading everything and watching everything about what you reveal. So that's been over the years. Baseball has been well documented. There's cameras everywhere. There's reporters everywhere. It's a really well covered sport. So some people, by design, are a little more closed off when it comes to communicating to your fan base. You might see some organizations that just don't share a lot. I look at some of the other sports. Some of the injury designations are upper body, lower body. They don't get overly specific for those same reasons that we just talked about. You're competing against them, and you don't want to reveal too much. So there's the art of saying or answering a question without saying much. And we've got a few that are very talented at that. And I don't even think they realize it, but they do a lot of talking, but not really share a lot of specifics around competition.
Which I think in certain scenarios can be incredibly helpful. Other scenarios might be a detriment to you. So I think the key, like all the things we talk about in the Human Optimization Project, is being intentional about what your goal is. Use your communication to effectively achieve that. Dustin, you've walked us through a lot here in explaining what communication is, discussing, why we struggle with it, and giving us a lot of tips and tricks. I want to kind of, as we wrap this thing up, and we start talking about steps that folks can take to be better at it, I want to get some take-home tips that we can get for our audience. So now that we know that this is a skill and we can improve it, what are some of the best tips you can give us, kind of the high leverage things to communicate? And first, maybe I'll ask you, what are some tips on improving our one-on-one communication? Then I'll ask you about to a larger group. So one-on-one communication.
I'll jump through a few that have been helpful for me, but, active listening, I call that like fully engaged. Today, there's so many distractions. I think when people are, kind of on their phone and take their eye off of the person they're speaking with, it just lessens the effectiveness of the communication. So active listening, empathy, I think you have to show some empathy. Again, we touched on it earlier, but kind of putting yourself in their shoes. If the situation calls for it, you might want to walk into it with, sensitivity to what they're going through. Nonverbal communication, eye contact and body language, being present, being there with the individual that might be sharing some very vulnerable news to you or asking for a promotion or something like that. You need to. You can't be slouched in your chair, and you can't be, looking out the window. Just that nonverbal is very important, and regular check-ins too. I mean, just don't consider the conversation over. I think with today's world and schedules, you might only have 30 minutes one day. If you don't get everything accomplished, don't be afraid to check back in later in the day or the next day. Being present, again, we touched on it. It's just be there, be in the room. Understand what the individual might be looking for or what you're looking for. Maybe set the tone when you walk into a room and say, listen, I need 10 minutes of your time. I need you to be, listening to what I have to say and let me finish expressing my thoughts before you respond.
That's great.
That's some advice I give some coworkers that just feel they never get the opportunity to express their full thought before almost being interrupted or somebody jumping to a conclusion.
And I'm sure all of those things still apply when you're talking to a large group. But are there any additional tips that you might layer on for somebody who finds themselves in a position where they're either speaking to a large group publicly or virtually, electronically?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. Everybody's got a different style. If you're delivering a keynote speech in front of 200 people, it's a different feeling when you get up there, right? So, and you're generally more scripted and prepared for what your remarks are going to be. So, as you're preparing for a large audience, I think you've got to catch their attention from the beginning. You've got to engage with the audience from the beginning, and you have to know your audience. I think the situation may call for a different tone or a different delivery, or maybe you're mixing in humor. You just really have to know what the situation is, and you should. If you're asked to speak at an event, you should ask the appropriate questions to know what you're walking into. And in our work at the Twins, we do a lot of that, whether it's a season ticket holder group or it's a town hall style at a pub. It might be a different version, but if we're delivering at our media luncheon, our annual media luncheon, I'm going to have, our leaders that give the business update and the baseball update. I'm going to provide talking points. Hey, here are the big items that they're looking for. I've done the homework on the audience, but it's, 100 media members that are going to write what you say. And there's cameras in the room. I always try to alert if you're speaking or whoever's speaking, this is live, this is recorded, there's cameras, there's iPhone video. Just be aware of it. And also, again, body language is a piece of public speaking too. I mean, are you behind a podium? Are you walking? Do you have visuals that you're going to be referencing on a screen? And then again, the art of storytelling. I think it's important to mix in maybe a personal story or a way to connect with the audience based on your homework on who you're talking to. So, and there's some great storytellers out there, right? But not every executive or every person or every athlete has all of those skills. So again, if you do your homework and you kind of script it out and do the best you can to, reference your notes, but make eye contact with somebody in the room or pretend like you are. A lot of times I'll look to the back of the room and it appears like I'm looking at somebody beyond somebody and I'm engaged with the audience. You don't want to just be down the whole time, but it's easier said than done. Takes some practice. But if you're speaking in front of a large group, there's somebody that thinks you can do it and that you should do it, and you've got a good message to tell.
Wonderful. Well, to kind of summarize everything we've talked about through the session, we've gone through a lot. A few of the big take-home points for me is I like the way we talked about communicating to individuals versus a group. A lot of the principles are the same. You did a great job of listing out some tips. I was taking notes there, so I'm going to kind of recap. For me, the ones that stood out and the top tips for connecting one-on-one: be an active listener, be empathetic, pay attention to the nonverbal cues, check in with the other person periodically on a scheduled basis. Be present in the moment. And also, I think for connecting with a large group, make sure you're prepared, grab their attention, know your audience, use the right tone, appropriately set the stage and expectation, use good body language, and tell a story. So I think those are all phenomenal tips. We'll come back to those in the action item at the end. I also like the discussion we had about a lot of interpersonal conflict coming down to either a lack of perspective or poor communication. And I think that anytime you find yourself in an argument, if you can check yourself on those two things. It can be really helpful. We also, you mentioned being present, and that's something new that you taught me. I'd never thought about that before, and that oftentimes people will blow off communication and think it's not important because they're not being present. But on the flip side of that, somebody can be too present at times and be too worried and overanalyze, and that probably drives a lot of the fear and anxiety that we have. But to counterbalance that, you mentioned sometimes if you feel awkward or you feel uncomfortable asking that question, do it if appropriate, because there may be others in the room that have that same question. And the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. So give yourself some grace. Know that it's going to take a little while. Be patient, but keep grinding. Great. So now I'm going to recap with the 3 big questions. So we've worked through these pretty extensively, but I'll give you a chance to answer them sort of quickly here. So our first big question that we set out for you today: what does effective communication look like, and why is it so important?
We talked about the C's, but being clear and concise and complete and correct is generally the way to success. And ultimately, it's whether it's finding a resolution to a disagreement or just finding a solution to whatever you're trying to accomplish. That is effective communication. And the more efficient you are, obviously you have time to dive into other things. So it's wildly important, and it's important to get it right and be open-minded.
Great. Our second question was, why do so many of us struggle with clear and effective communication?
Well, again, I mean, everybody's educated differently. There's different barriers, whether it's language or cultural differences, distractions, and just information overload can also affect the way people communicate with each other. So there's obviously a lot of things that disrupt smooth and clear communication, but those are kind of the big ones. I mean, and not always listening to the feedback. Sometimes that's the most challenging one, but take to heart what somebody says, at least process it before you get very defensive and turn a conversation into an argument.
And the last one, what steps can individuals take to become better communicators in their personal and professional lives?
Well, there's media training, but there's also just practice. As silly as this sounds, I've looked in the mirror, I've written a speech and just tried to deliver it. How many times does it take me until I memorize certain parts of it? That's kind of the public speaking or large group. But when you're one-on-one, try to find the different people that you sit with and talk with. Do your homework on them. Try to find different things about their background that might create a more casual, inviting a conversation. Right. I think making somebody comfortable, both you and that person, the communication is going to be much better. So it's something I always try to do, set the tone with some humor on the front end, maybe a coffee or a lunch, just so you're on the same page.
Great. So we always try to wrap this up with a call to action that we want our audience to do. So the one that I have for everybody this time is, I want you to pick one item out of that list that Dustin gave us in the third section on tips to become a better communicator. And just to recap: active listening, be empathetic, nonverbal skills, check in, be present, use appropriate tone, grab their attention, know your audience, set the stage, and tell a good story. So pick one of those items and then intentionally focus on that during the next 3 conversations. Do it at least 3 times. And I want you to think about how challenging it is the first time compared to the second time compared to the third. I bet it'll be difficult the first time, but it'll get easier as you keep going. So keep doing that, keep practicing, keep getting better at it. So that's going to be our main action item. Our second one is for all the Twins keyboard warriors out there. You just heard that Dustin is open to feedback, and he always listens. So keep grinding away on those keyboards and sending him all your thoughts based on his social media posts and everything else you think about him. He takes those to heart and listens. But I would encourage you to remember what I said about the conflict part. And before you send that message, before you hit enter and you post it or you send that DM, ask yourself, am I lacking perspective somewhere in here, or am I doing a poor job in my communication? I read a lot of those, and I think oftentimes both of those are problems in those messages. So just think about that before you send that message. So there it is. Dustin Morris just did an amazing job of walking us through this session: the power of connection, how to communicate effectively with anyone. This is a very big topic, but a lot of really good take-home points. Dustin, thank you so much for joining us today and letting us steal from your years of experience and wisdom.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
All right. To our audience, thank you for joining us. And as always, remember to live intentionally, consistently better. Keep striving to be the best human you can be and never stop optimizing.